Hey, this is Tom, and welcome to part 2 of 2010's Tom's Sculpting Archives. This part of it has some really cool figures that are really special to me. I was starting to practice with some different mediums and get a little bit more settled with how I wanted to sculpt. And more importantly, this is where I really started the ball rolling on getting my own line of miniatures going, with 3 sci-fi miniatures and 2 fantasy miniatures to start Effigy Miniatures. And that leads me to some exciting news. When I went to work for Recon Games many years ago, I sold the rights to my core Effigy Miniatures and Have a Protocol line to a very nice gentleman, Dave Farr, who took care of them and made them available while I was working for them. Until recently, when Dave approached me about taking them back into the Effigy Miniatures line proper. So I'm very pleased to announce they're all back in the online store now, so you can pick up all the Havoc Protocol miniatures, some of which I'll be talking about in this very Sculpting Archives. I want to say a huge thanks to Dave for taking care of the line while I was away and giving me the chance to bring them back within Effigy Miniatures. All right, let's dive into part 2 of 2010's Tom's Sculpting Archives. Going through these sculpting archives always brings up lots of memories of how I went about learning techniques and the things that I figured out and started to teach to others over the years. And if you would like to learn more and up your miniature sculpting game, click the link down in the description below and get my ultimate quick start guide to sculpting miniatures.
The Roller Derby Girl. This is a figure that I sculpted for Jason Weeby's Boutique Miniatures line, Cargo Cult Miniatures. He reached out to several of his fellow sculptors to lend our talents to a little team of roller derby girls that he wanted to make. I was really honored to be asked, and it was nice to get a chance to work on something very different than what I had been typically sculpting. This sculpt was a chance to do a lot of different things. One, I wasn't making a sci-fi soldier or a fantasy warrior. It was just a regular human, playing a sport. And it was a girl, which I hadn't typically sculpted still many at this point. And whenever I ended up walking away from doing my more typical sort of work, I would always find myself jumping materials as well. It's like when I was in a mode of sculpting the Mercs or sculpting something for Reaper, I would tend to stick with whatever material was on. But this one saw me get back to green stuff again. But I was looking at the figure, and in my memory, I also think I was trying out a few other things. I can see a bit on the body where there's a slight tonal difference or value difference in the material. And I'm pretty sure, even though this figure appears to be green stuff, that I was using a mix that was it was most likely a mix of Procreate and green stuff, because I was still pretty much strictly putty at this time. But I was still not super in love with putty, even though that's what I was using. So I was looking for the right mix that would help the figure feel better when I was sculpting it and working on it. And I have no idea why the underwear was purely done in Procreate. I'm sure I was having trouble, and I just had to go back to a material that I was really familiar with in order to get that right. You can actually still pick up this figure and all the other ones that go along with it from Impact Miniatures. The Witch Cat for DGS Miniatures was another in a series of animal creature figures that I was doing for their Free Blades game. This was very different for me. Like, I never did a lot of creatures, never did a lot of animals, but I was very eager to branch out and try new things. I spent a lot of time printing out the reference to scale size to help guide me with the armature. When you're sculpting humans a lot, you just kind of start to learn the right proportions and feel and size. But with these sort of things, it's much harder, at least it is for me, to gauge what the size and proportion that the figure is going to turn out to be once it gets all posed and everything. So I really needed that as a guidance to help make the armature correctly. Now you'll notice again, I bulked up the figure primarily with green stuff, but there's a few areas where it looks like it's kind of a grayish green, and that's where I was once again mixing green stuff and Procreate. But I think towards the end I did start doing most of the fur strictly in Procreate. You might also notice in some of the images that the head keeps changing, and that's because I ended up having a lot of reworks. One of the things about working with GGS, they really knew what they wanted, and they were very good art directors. So I would sometimes sculpt more in what I guess at this time I would call my style, or something that I just thought looked good. And sometimes as an artist you get blinders on where you aren't quite one-to-one creating the concept art that is being presented to you. So they did a great job of guiding me and giving good feedback to just help pushing it more, especially in the eyes. They really wanted this thing to look wild and otherworldly, and by pushing the expression in the face, it really helped change it from just looking like some sort of panther creature to something that was truly menacing. The Yeti is yet another creature done for DGS. And while this figure was more man-shaped, man-like, it's much different proportions, different size. So I used the same technique I did on the Witch Cat, where I printed out the concept art to size to help establish things and built my armature in comparison to that. It also helped me follow along and stay a little more true to the pose that was presented there. Now this figure I bulked up significantly with green stuff because I just had a lot of it. I had switched mostly to Procreate, but I always like to use green stuff underneath on the wires because it sticks there better, and like I said, I just had so much of it, so I would bulk the figure up quite a bit. And certain elements like the chest and the face I ended up sculpting primarily and building up even further with Procreate. But then I went over it with Procreate or a mix of green stuff Procreate to do the fur. Now I want to address the fur both on the Witch Cat and on the Yeti. I don't think it's terrible, but texture was never really my thing with sculpting. I used these figures as a way to really start learning and try and teach myself or figure out how I wanted to do it, but I think it's easier to do fur, and actually looks better when you have figures and concepts that are have more tufts and mange, that sort of thing. When you have just a fine texture of hair, it doesn't look as good. And I'm speaking for myself. Obviously, there's sculptors more talented than I that can do it and do it great, but it just felt so tedious. But I really felt like I needed to have a texture on there and couldn't just have the figure be plain, smooth. Otherwise, it would just look like skin. The Sci-Fi chick Recon. This is a continuation from the series of sci-fi girls that I wanted to make that I had started them over a year ago. From this point when I finally got back to it to work on this one. Now at this point I decided not to dabble with trying to do Fimo, and I just stuck with what I knew. I used Procreate and a little bit of green stuff for some of the accent items. The interesting thing about these figures, I had so much fun doing them and just being totally free to sculpt completely in my style, because I would do my own concept artwork as well as the figure itself. And whenever I do that, even today, I just feel like I can really nail down what I want the miniature to look like a lot better than if I were to go straight into sculpting. But I was having a confidence problem, and that was really holding me back from working on my own pieces. Ever since I got into sculpting, I knew I wanted to make my own line of miniatures and do my own pieces. Now, of course, I had dreams of working with other companies, with other sculptors, and I started to realize those with working with companies like Reaper and WizKids. But in my heart of hearts, I really just wanted to do my own thing. I wanted to make my own pieces. And but that was hard. That was hard, easier said than done for me. I was doing this as a side hustle, and it was hard to say no to the freelance gig money that other companies were willing to pay me. And frankly, there were some really fun figures to be done for them as well. But as you'll see in the coming figure count in the coming years, I do eventually realize that dream of having my own line of miniatures. The Cell Swords Dwarf is a real big milestone for me. This is the first miniature that I sculpted completely out of polyclay. Mostly, obviously, there's a small bit of his mug that was done in green stuff or a Procreate green stuff mix, but as you can see, the whole thing. I even did his hammer, which I love how that thing turned out, completely in polyclay. I don't know why I always mix that up still to this day. Something flipping in my brain. Anyways, I did the whole thing in polyclay while it was positioned and set on the figure. And it's actually something that I think about maybe that I should be doing more. It would probably make it a lot more enjoyable for me to do equipment and weapons, because it's one of my least favorite things to do. But sometimes it just feels impractical or not stable enough. And not to toot my own horn, but I think this figure looks fantastic. I was seriously blown away at what I was able to accomplish. The only thing I don't like about it is I think the way he's holding his arm up with the mug looks a little weird. It actually makes me want to go back and modify this figure, because I think I could make him look a lot more interesting if I did something else. But what happened was I was so focused on, just coming up with a simple resting pose that I could really showcase different things. I've got the gnarled muscles and a great looking hand pose and all the chainmail and the face and the hair, and then I thought, oh, he'll just be like holding his arm out, and then I realized I didn't know what I was going to have him do with it, and I didn't have any armature there, I didn't have anything attached, and I hadn't built up this understanding of how to work with a figure this way, bake it once then be done. And so I just went ahead and baked it, and then I was like, I guess I'll throw a mug on there. And it looks a little weird, it looks a little awkward, but other than that, I learned so much in doing this miniature. The crazy thing is, though, I didn't sculpt another polyclay figure for over a year with nearly 20 miniatures in between. But that's a story for another time. Thanks for coming with me as we go through another Tom's Sculpting Archives. Hey, that's me. There's many more to come. Until next time, keep sculpting.